Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Matt Jacobs, Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. Thank you for coming out on just an awful day. Every time we partner with journalism, it seems like the weather is bad. So hopefully we can we can try to turn that around here, hopefully. So a couple of quick announcements, and then I'll do a couple of other things here really quickly. First, thank you for those of you here joining us physically here, but also those of you joining us through YouTube Live. We will have a Q&A portion of the session near the end. For those of you joining us remotely, you just need to submit your questions through the chat feature on YouTube there. I want to thank the team here, as always, the Bob Graham Center team, Marianne Vernetson, our Associate Director and Director of Public Programs, Dorothy Zimmerman, who's our Director of Communications, and particularly Isabella Garcia, who's our actually undergraduate student assistant who helps do all of our programming. She's actually been running point on most of this for us today, so thank you very much, Isa, excuse me. I also want to thank College of Journalism and Communications, which has become a really valued partner for us on a lot of different programs. Last week we partnered with them. We hosted Doug Brinkley down at the Cade Museum downtown, nationally well-known journalist and historian. And we've worked with them with the College of Journalism and Communications on a lot of different things and really value that partnership. And thank you very much for bringing us into this opportunity as well. One of the things that makes us so excited about working on the Science Journalist in Residence program is that more and more we're seeing that effective civic engagement, which is one of the central principles of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, requires understanding science. And you need look no further than 4 issues that have dominated public discourse over the last several years. The pandemic and vaccines, for example, AI, big tech and social media, and then even now the state of electric vehicles versus gas vehicles would be a big issue too. All of those requires great science journalism to help average people like me, a historian, think through those things. And so events like this and working with College of Journalism and Communications on bringing in science journalists to do a public talk really are valuable for us, and so we really appreciate it. It's now my pleasure to introduce Hub Brown, Dean of the College of Journalism and Communications. I've had the pleasure of working with Hub on a lot of different occasions now, and he generously participated back in March on a student-centered conversation on the relationship between the First Amendment and social media, and that was a wonderful experience, and thank you again, Hub, for participating in that. Hub joined UF in June of 2021 from the Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. I'm actually from north of Syracuse, so I'm familiar with that school and that university. It's a great institution and great school of communications as well. Before that, he worked for 15 years as a journalist as well. And in that context, I actually want to draw your attention to a piece Hub published earlier this year in February in the Independent Florida Alligator, titled Black History, Our History. In that essay, Hub noted that when he graduated from college and started working as a reporter in rural Nebraska, most of the people whose stories he told did not look like him. He continued, quote, "But as a journalist, that mattered little to me. Every human has a story, and every story has value." I close with that because in a moment where we see journalism as a field getting sucked into larger conversations about division and polarization, it is a reminder that journalism can also serve to bring people together in our common humanity. Thank you, Hub, for making that very clear to us, and please join me in welcoming Dean Hub Brown. I'm stuck to the tape, so the Velcro got me.
Yeah, we're working on the equipment issues here, but thank you, Matt, and I really value, our friendship and our relationship. College of Journalism here with the Graham Center, we've been able to do fantastic things together. I'm always excited when we have another a guest or another topic to really get into, sink our teeth into, and work on together. So I am very appreciative of our work together. And I get to do this great honor of introducing our guest today, Helena Bottemiller Evich. Helena is the founder and editor-in-chief of Food Fix. Most recently, she led coverage of food and agriculture issues at Politico for nearly a decade. winning numerous awards for her work, including a George Polk Award for a series on climate change and 2 James Beard Awards for features on nutrition and science. In 2022, she was a James Beard Award finalist for a deep dive on diet-related diseases and COVID-19. I bet you didn't know that you didn't have to open up a restaurant to have a James Beard Award, but she's managed to do that. Before launching Politico's food policy coverage in 2013, Helena was the Washington correspondent for Food Safety News, where she covered deadly foodborne illness outbreaks and the run-up to Congress passing the most significant update to food safety law in a century. Helena is a sought-after speaker and commentator on food issues, appearing on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, BBC, and NPR, among others. Her work is widely cited in media and has also been published in the Columbia Journalism Review and on NBC News. Helena was born and raised in Washington State. She attended Claremont McKenna College, where she studied government. And she now lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, toddler, I'm told a fairly tall toddler, tall dude, and a tabby cat. We had a really marvelous conversation yesterday about a whole lot of issues, and some of it sort of centered on both what worries both of us to death, and there's a long list, but there's also a lot that we were able to talk about in terms of how much better we're getting at telling the climate story, and how much more demand there is for climate journalists and for the kinds of conversations that we're having here. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Helena Bottemiller Evich.
I think you're good. I'm just going to watch out for that. It's funny you bring up the James Beard. I actually did have colleagues in the newsroom come up to me after I won my first James Beard Award and said, "I didn't know you cooked." And I thought, no, it's really hard to win a James Beard Award for the culinary side. They also do journalism and book awards. So anyway, it's a very fun, it's the Oscars of food world is what we call that. So anyway, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here. I've had a great couple of days just learning about, this is my first time to the University of Florida, and it's really clear that the students here have a lot of experience, like while you're in school. I can just tell by the questions I'm getting. I visit a lot of different colleges and universities, and so that's really stood out to me. And it's been fun also bouncing back and forth between the agriculture folks and the journalism folks, and it's been very fun. So today, I don't want to be a downer, okay? But today, the topic is reporting on food policy amid a journalism implosion. And I don't use that word lightly. I think we really are in an implosion. I'm going to talk about why. But we're also going to talk about some bright spots. And we're going to walk through kind of where I see the future of the news media, and what worries me, what keeps me up at night, which is what we were talking about the other day. And then I'm also going to walk through some of the big issues that I've been covering. Even though there is an implosion happening in journalism, there are a lot of important topics to cover, particularly in the food space, which is where I have been focused for the past 15 years. Oh, is it going to advance? I'm hitting the button. No? Oh, there we go. It's awake now. I don't know. Okay, we're good. I know we're ironing out tech issues. We're good. So this is a newsletter that I wrote the other day. As Hub mentioned, I was at Politico for a long time, but I left back in 2022 to launch my own publication called Food Fix. It is in the form of a twice-a-week newsletter, so it's half paid, half free. This was the free edition last Friday. Why the media implosion scares me, and I had been meaning to write this piece for a while, mostly because, I live in Washington, I know a lot of journalists, and everyone has been talking about the layoffs. You've probably seen news of the layoffs, like, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, so many news outlets, NBC News, there were buyouts at the Washington Post, BuzzFeed News doesn't exist anymore, Vice is no more pretty much. I think maybe they keep the name alive so it's like a zombie brand, but National Geographic's laid off all its staff writers. I think Sports Illustrated has done the same. It has been really bleak. And a lot of journalists are talking about this, saying, what's the future hold? There's a lot of trepidation. And it really does scare me for a lot of reasons. The big ones are, you're just gonna have less journalism, less content to read that is vetted, that is fact-checked, where there has been some institutional focus on making sure the information is accurate. And then, being in Washington and covering the federal government, I worry about fewer checks on the government, right? Fewer reporters just asking questions, fewer reporters to, corner a government official and ask them something they don't want to talk about. And that is something that really, it keeps me up at night, it really does. So why is this happening? I get asked this question a lot. Random people ask me, family members ask me, like, are you okay, right? Why are you in journalism? It's a good question, right? Like, it is a tumultuous time. There's some really big kind of systemic reasons that I think are kind of factoring into the landscape we have now, so I'm gonna walk through a couple of those. This first slide here shows you, basically in 2019, according to at least one set of data, we kind of hit the tipping point where we were spending more time on the internet than like watching TV. So we're seeing this move, obviously this digital explosion, and we're moving away from things like TV and print. Well, TV and print are distribution models that media companies can control, right? They usually know who's tuning in, they know which addresses are getting the paper, they have control of the distribution. When things went digital, the news media lost a lot of control of that distribution. So if you just think about how you would get a random New York Times article, you might search Google or Google News, you might see it on Facebook. There's usually some sort of intermediary between you and that content. And that is really what we've seen happen. This pie chart is from a couple years ago, but it shows that 18% of US adults, or about 1 in 5 adults, are primarily getting their political news through social media. I think this number is a lot higher, like way higher now, and also way, way higher for young adults. And so if you're getting your information on social media, that means you're not going directly to the source often, right? So this presents some challenges for the news industry. Because if you're not showing up at the site, then those eyeballs cannot be monetized by the actual news company that's producing the content. So increasingly we're all getting our news on social media, but social media doesn't really want to be in the news business. They're moving away from distributing news content, for better or for worse. This is a chart that shows how basically the reach of Facebook in news is declining over time, and this is very purposeful. After a lot of controversy about what algorithms are serving up, right? What content is getting served? Is misinformation being overly promoted and vetted information isn't? There's been a lot of controversy, right? So a company like Meta, which does Facebook and Instagram, is kind of like, why are we doing this, right? They really want to move away from it. And even Threads, which is sort of like the new social media platform for text that's trying to replace X or Twitter, they're very purposely they don't want to do news content. And so this is a challenge. Well, TikTok is kind of on the rise, but TikTok's never going to send you to the NewYorkTimes.com, right? That's not going to happen. So what we're seeing is a massive decline in traffic from places like Facebook to news outlets and other media sites. And this, again, is affecting the news industry's ability to monetize that audience. They don't have control over it. This is just since 2022. So this is like a short amount of time that this has happened. So I think this is part of the fuel behind some of the layoffs. It's like looking at the future of these audiences. They're smaller. And because news organizations don't have, again, that direct connection, they've sort of lost control of the distribution, there's a lot of turmoil. There's just a lot of turmoil about like where we're headed and what it means for the business. So essentially, this all means that we are in what I think is like a pretty massive decentralization of information and sort of news sharing. So this is this is an example. This is a snippet from a New York Times story comparing the reach of one TikTok creator. He's a news creator, which is different than a journalist, right? You're not working for a media company, but is sharing news on TikTok. The reach of this one news creator has 10 million followers on TikTok, compared to the New York Times has 570,000, BBC News has 2.6 million. So just like, this is a new era where individuals can, for better or for worse, have these really enormous platforms, and it's also just very decentralized. So this presents a lot of challenges just to the business, but also to how consumers generally are getting information and then able to vet like what's fact and what's fiction. It becomes much more difficult. And one thing that I think is so interesting about these images is, if you look at the first one, I'm pretty sure that TikTok creator is using a screenshot from the New York Times. So the information may still be coming from these institutional news outlets, but they're not able to monetize that in any way. They're not getting traffic or eyeballs or anything. So it's kind of like you're sucking the value out of it, which is good because you want good information to be spreading, obviously, but it just presents an incredible level of challenge. And the bad news is it's going to get a lot worse. It's going to get a lot worse. So this is a screenshot I took of a little experiment I did with Gemini, which is Google's ChatGPT. Just curious, how many of you have used ChatGPT or any of the AI? Okay, so are we talking like dabbling or use it in daily life? Daily life? Okay, so most of us have played around with this. The reason I'm so concerned about AI is that it really, really eliminates the need for going to a news site in many cases. And so this is a really good example. I typed in, why did the Baltimore Bridge collapse and what's next? This is Gemini. Each of these arrows actually does cite a news source. But you have almost no reason to go to those because this has regurgitated it to you. And in a very succinct and efficient way. I mean, this is a useful tool. But again, what does this mean for the folks who are actually creating journalism, doing the reporting on the ground? You don't have to go to the Baltimore Banner or the Baltimore Sun. And they're the ones who have reporters on the ground who are actually talking to local officials, talking to workers, trying to figure out what happened, getting that original information. And so this is a real challenge. There are some news organizations who've decided to fight this. So the New York Times is engaged in some legal battles over essentially like how do you make sure news organizations are compensated for this reporting, for this information. They are, I think, in a lawsuit with OpenAI. Where I used to work, Politico was recently purchased by Axel Springer, which is a big media German company, and they've actually struck a deal with OpenAI to have the large language models train on Axel Springer's content, which is funny because that means my content that I wrote for a decade is now training the robots that are going to replace a lot of journalism jobs. But I think it really presents a big challenge for these leaders in the industry. Like, what do? You know that any content that's freely out there, they can use right now to train their models on. So there's going to be a lot of, I think, debate, probably some court cases, maybe some policy, but I don't know, around just like, how do you maybe set guardrails? Is there compensation? Like, how is this all going to work? Because this presents a really big strain. And I actually think that the distribution disruption for content could be a lot more severe with AI than it actually was with social media. Like with social media, it was sort of that the news briefly got this like, hooray, like Facebook's sending us all this traffic, like we'll do viral content, which is why you saw like a lot of BuzzFeed articles everywhere. That was sort of like a discrete era. Whereas now with AI, I think you could see like a fundamental reshaping of how people consume information, and you could be breaking the links even more for even seeking out original or like the direct, news content. And I mean, I have to admit, this is really useful. Like, and I'm not anti-AI. Like, I use AI tools. Otter is a really popular tool for journalists to use for transcription, even like drafting. So there are, incredible opportunities. I think it can make journalists more efficient. But just in terms of the business side and the content distribution, there is a lot to be concerned about here. So, some bright spots. I don't want to like sugarcoat anything. I think there's going to be a lot more upheaval in the news industry because of these trends. Full stop. You're going to see more layoffs. You're going to see more news outlets not make it. But there are some examples of smaller, independent, very focused media outlets, newsletters, journalist platforms that are coming online that are actually finding some footing and I think some sustainable business models, which is really great. So these are a couple of examples. Does anyone read any of these? I'm just curious. Has anyone reached a couple? Yeah. Oh. So there's ways to go. These are fairly narrow. So Tangle is a former political reporter who every day takes one big issue in the news and summarizes everything the right is saying, everything the left is saying, and then at the end does like a little bit of analysis, and has found an incredible audience for that. It's not a lot of original reporting, but it's really helpful analysis, and it's a half-paid product, so they're able to like actually have a staff of writers. And I think there is some original like interviews and things happening, which is great. Platformer is one that covers tech. So Platformer was very, very instrumental in cataloging all of the drama around Elon Musk buying Twitter, which is now X. They have 2 full-time reporters. They have a sustainable business model. It's part paid, part free. They were on Substack and I think just moved to a different platform. Law Dork is also former mainstream reporter, covers the Supreme Court in depth, like really in depth. And this is useful for people. It's also part paid, part free. Food Fix, which is what I launched in 2022, is also part of this. It's very focused on food policy. The audience is, part paid, part free, and it's really folks who are interested in what's going on in food in Washington, food news, trends, innovation, with a policy lens. And because I know exactly who's on it, because they signed up for a very specific reason, and because I have their email, there isn't, the tech companies can't really get between you and your audience as much. All of these are email-based, which is so old-fashioned, right? It almost feels like we're launching, media companies with like fax machines. This is like kind of old school, right? In this age of like information and digital transformation, but email right now is the most stable distribution for media. That may change, but for right now, it is the way. So Heated is also a really good one on climate change, really narrowly focused on, calling out greenwashing, tracking like where different fossil fuel companies are advertising. Like it's just really focused on kind of the day-to-day climate, the climate fights, the narratives around that. And then Puck is really interesting. Does anyone read Puck? Just curious? No? Okay. Well, they've got some upside to be had there still. So they do Silicon Valley, Washington, I think they do finance, fashion. They have some like verticals, I guess. I think they do the music industry as well. And it's individual reporters who they basically build brands around them. So it's kind of going with this like decentralization theme where they're building publications around people instead of, focusing only on a big brand where like the reporters are less a part of the brand. And it's just kind of fits into this broader trend of like how media companies are trying to figure out what the future looks like. So I think this experimentation is really good. I should also mention there's an outlet called the 19th News, which is based in Texas, I believe. They're doing pretty well. I think there's a new documentary out about them. Also, just last week, Sequencer magazine was launched by a couple of science reporters. So if you're into science journalism, I definitely recommend checking that out. And of course, it was launched by reporters who used to have full-time staff jobs, and wherever they worked folded. And so there's kind of this new era of journalists trying to figure out a new path forward. So hopefully these will grow, and they will find audience, and they will continue to sort of present a way forward. The one thing I'm really worried about is you'll notice each of these is really focused on a topic. It's not generalist media. It's not for the average person to just get caught up on the news. They're not focused locally, although there are some examples of local news, of local coverage doing this. And I'm not sure that we've seen enough experimentation with that. Like, what do you do about that? And if it's not focused on a particular audience, how do you figure out the business model around that can be sustainable? Because it's not going to be ad-based. It's not going to be mass appeal, like national outlets. Like, it's basically the way we talk about it in the, now I'm like part of the journalism like biz space. It's the scale, the era of scale is over. And that's the way it's talked about now. And now it's like small is the future. Smaller, probably less ambitious, probably fewer staff, but hopefully more sustainable. So that's kind of the hope. That is the positive note I want to leave you with. But even though the media is imploding, I am still covering all of these important issues. I want to go over some of the top issues that I've been following. And, one of the things that's interesting about what I'm doing is like, food is really narrow. Like, it sounds like this really niche topic, but actually it touches so many parts of the economy, the environment, public health. And so I've actually found like a pretty good audience that's a mix of consumers and also people who work in this space. And so that's been really encouraging to see, that it's not just folks who work in the food industry or who work at food banks or whatever. It's also like nurses and teachers and people who like are just parents and are curious about school meals. And it's been encouraging to see that get some momentum there. So this is some of the graphics from a story I did back in 2022. This is one of the last big stories I did before I left Politico. And I'm still really covering the aftermath, so I thought I would tell you a little bit about it. If you Google FDA food failure, this is the first thing that comes up. So I recommend you read it. I'm sure FDA loves that this is the first thing that comes up. But I really took 15 years of covering this agency and unpacked sort of why it's not working, right? Like why food safety and nutrition and other issues that FDA is supposed to be on top of, why they take so long, why are we not making progress, And when I say things take a long time, in some cases, the examples were taking decades to do kind of simple things. And I talked to did over 50 interviews for this piece. I really laid out why it is so slow, why it is so dysfunctional. And this went from like the structure of the staffing to the structure of Congress not holding it accountable. Also, the infant formula crisis was part of this because this happened to be unfolding right at the same time. And then I walked through some of the nutrition examples because diet-related diseases have continued to worsen. We've really not made progress there, and FDA has jurisdiction over 80% of the food supply, and traditionally has been so much more focused on the drug side, medical devices, vaccines. I mean, FDA has a really expansive purview. They actually regulate something like 20% of the economy. Like, it's big. Cosmetics, drugs, vaccines, medical devices, and then 80% of the food supply. But food is sort of this lower tier issue. It has been for a long time. So one of the things I wrote about in here was that there's kind of like a running joke within FDA that the F in FDA is silent, which again, people hated, but it was 100% true. And John Oliver actually last fall did this really great segment pulling from a lot of this reporting. And he really had some fun with that one. He's like, it's literally the beginning of it's the Food and Drug Administration. And it's true, sometimes FDA commissioners actually forget and call it the Federal Drug Administration. So, two quick examples from this story. This is one of the charts we made just showing that major foodborne illness outbreaks have kind of continued on despite a big food safety law that was passed back in 2011. FDA has been really slow to implement like some of the most important parts of that law. We were talking last night with some faculty about how difficult it is to come up with basically safety standards for the water that we use in produce to grow fresh produce. And it is really complicated, like there's no question about it. But is it like 14 years complicated because we still don't have a water standard in place? And Congress really hasn't held FDA's feet to the fire to make sure that this is done, and it's still not actually in effect. And apparently is so complicated still, even after they redid it, that folks are really frustrated about it. So, not a great example. The other piece I guess chapter in that story was about looking at FDA's work to try to reduce sodium across the American food supply. They've taken an approach where they've basically set voluntary goals for the industry. So it's not a regulatory approach. It's sort of like, can we nudge them? Can we convince the food industry to kind of slowly reduce salt over time? And the reason this is important is government officials have estimated that probably tens of thousands of premature deaths could be avoided if we reduce sodium and improved cardiovascular health. So this chart shows that in the UK, they have made a lot more progress with their sodium reduction work, and the exact same items at McDonald's, Burger King, and Subway have way less sodium in the UK. And so kind of showing the everyday person impact, public health impact of the slowness and sort of the consequences of that in the US. And it just so happened that right when I did this story, this big story about FDA's failures and dysfunction, it was right during the middle of the infant formula crisis. And FDA has really taken a lot of criticism for how slowly they responded, not just to the infant deaths that initially led to the investigation, which found egregious food safety problems in this plant, but also questions about why they didn't find the problems in their inspections, their routine inspections to begin with. So a lot of questions. I did a lot of the reporting at Politico, just uncovering like how slow they were, things they had missed. I mean, a whistleblower had literally sent documents to top FDA officials outlining like pretty serious food safety allegations from the plant that ended up at the center of this. And that had happened months ahead of time. So being able to reveal some of this stuff, again, is like one of the reasons why I worry about fewer reporters, because were it not for some focus on this and some digging and some, original reporting, we never would have known how much they had bungled the situation. And that's the FDA commissioner before Congress. Congress definitely had some questions about the infant formula crisis. They were, I think they had 3 hearings in 1 week on it. And it was like the most FDA had been dragged in front of Congress in a long, long time. And then after this, so I think to FDA's credit, they really recognized how, how slow their timeline had been, and also just how much pressure had been, how much scrutiny they'd been under, and they commissioned an outside review of the agency with a lot of outside experts who had access to current and former FDA officials. They did this whole process, essentially confirmed most of what I reported, which is that the agency is really dysfunctional, didn't have someone in charge of decision making. There's various reasons for things being really slow. And of course, I'm still covering this with my newsletter because now we're in a situation where FDA is reorganizing. They're trying to kind of get their house in order. They have a new person in charge. They actually have a single decision maker on foods. And one of the big things I'm still following is, how that's going, right? Is it working? Like, are we going to end up on the other side of this having a more functional agency? And the jury is still out on that. One of the other big issues I'm following is the narrative and increasing concern around ultra-processed foods. You probably have all read about ultra-processed foods in recent weeks or months. There's been a ton of press coverage on this, largely driven, interestingly, by a book by a British physician. That's Chris Van Tulleken in this picture right here. I think that's him with NPR. But the book is called Ultra Processed People, and it's gotten a ton of attention, ton of coverage, ton of reviews. And essentially what we're seeing now is a lot more research coming out, finding associations between the consumption of ultra-processed foods and poor health outcomes, like obesity, diabetes, other outcomes that we definitely are trying to tackle, not successfully. And the reason this is such a big deal is that more than half of the American diet is now considered ultra-processed. And so trying to figure out what's going on here is very important. We're also seeing the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which is like this government panel, or this government advisory panel that is looking at the question of like what the association between ultra-processed foods and obesity is. And this is making the food industry really nervous, because if there were enough research and one day the government might recommend, like, should you eat less? Should you eat fewer ultra-processed foods? That could have really broad ripple effects across the country, and of course would be quite concerning for food companies who sell ultra-processed foods. I wrote a newsletter in February about this. It's fun. I still have editors, but it's fun to write a newsletter because you get to be just a little bit more informal in your headlines. And in fact, a student asked me about this the other day. They were like, I saw you use the word vibes in your story, in your newsletter. It's true. I do sometimes. In fact, earlier I was on a panel and I used, one of the headlines we had was that the government shutdown was like a shit show. And it was. So anyway, I did a story about how the FDA commissioner has started talking about ultra-processed foods for the first time ever. And this was back in February. And because I've been following this so long, I was sort of uniquely able to recognize that it was really unique that the FDA commissioner was weighing in. And essentially what he said was, we're watching the research closely, we're concerned about this, but we need more research. And this is a big issue in nutrition. We have a lot of observational research, which finds associations between consuming something and an outcome. But we have very little of the highly controlled research you need to actually prove like causation or to understand mechanisms. And so that is a huge issue with ultra-processed foods. So while we're trying to sort through that, there's a whole big thing happening with Ozempic. This is not really a policy story, but I've been covering it pretty closely because it feels like it has the potential to shift dynamics pretty substantially. So I'm sure many of you have read some of these headlines. Ozempic is sort of the shorthand for a diabetes drug that is now, a class of drugs, GLP-1s, that are now broadly approved for weight loss. And they really do seem to not only cut calorie consumption, but also change the type of foods that an individual is consuming. It doesn't work for everyone, but it is the most effective pharmaceutical intervention we've seen. And this is really freaking out the food companies, even more so than whatever the dietary guidelines may say down the road. This headline, Ozempic maker Novo gets calls from scared food CEOs, like had a lot of people talking. The idea that you would have like the food industry CEOs calling the drug or the pharmaceutical CEOs going, what are we gonna do? Like, what are you doing to us is just wild. And so this is a really big thing that I'm watching. There's a lot of questions about like how broadly it'll be adopted. It's very expensive. And there's a lot of questions about, you know, where this is going to go. Is insurance going to cover it? Are there long-term side effects we don't know about? I mean, there's a lot of unknowns, but the potential impact to an individual's consumption and sort of diet and behavior can be quite profound. So this is a really big issue to watch. Other big one is states are increasingly revolting and banning food additives that FDA allows. FDA's had a fairly hands-off approach to food additives and also to like re-reviewing food additives that have been on the market for a long time. So maybe there's some studies that have come out that have raised some questions. They're not as good at going back and like reviewing and sort of keeping up with all of that. And some states are like, screw you, FDA, we're just gonna ban them. And California actually did ban a handful of food additives last fall, and that's a de facto national ban because you can't just sell to every state but California or figure out how to like reformulate products that are only going to California. So, and California is just such a huge part of the American economy and the market. So this is a big issue, and it's really a states versus feds like power struggle, which has been really interesting to watch. So that's a big one. Another, I think, underappreciated story is the extent to which the states are trying to rebuild some of their COVID safety nets that we had during the first like 2 years of pandemic response. So we had universal free meals nationally, and then we ended that. But now this is a map of some of the states in green have actually passed universal free meals in their states because they really didn't want to like go back, and they want to make sure that food insecurity doesn't go up. They're trying to kind of piece together the pieces of the federal like safety net that we bolstered during the pandemic but then took away. And I think that's an issue a lot of people don't realize. The federal government gave out so much aid during that time that food insecurity actually did not go up. It's going up now, but it did not go up in the first 2 years of the response, which is, I think, surprising to folks. Last one, before we take questions, I want to leave some time. The Farm Bill, it's probably not happening. I mean, I don't know, Washington's like barely funding itself, or like the government's barely managing to stay funded these days. So large legislation is not super viable generally. The Farm Bill used to be easier. It used to be a more bipartisan sort of functional process. We've seen that gone off the rails a little bit, and I'm not expecting that to happen. We're actually already, the Congress had already extended the Farm Bill for another year. They were supposed to do it last fall. But Congress is just in a real gridlock position. So I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, but I'm watching it really closely. The Farm Bill is it's not branded correctly. It's 80% nutrition spending at this point. And so it really is a piece of legislation that affects policy for 40 million Americans, and obviously farmers and many of the pieces that make our agriculture system strong, and a lot of the it's just incredible how broad USDA's reach is. They do rural development, they do broadband. I mean, it's an incredibly broad bill, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. And that's why I have this cute little gridlock, although we'll see. There's nothing cute about the dysfunction. I want to be clear about that. It's very depressing to watch, especially Washington has gotten more dysfunctional every year I've been there. But as I said earlier, I don't think it's my fault. I think I'm just witnessing sort of a unique decline in functionality, which is not great. But anyway, if you are interested in food policy, I encourage you to sign up for my newsletter. You can get it for free on Fridays. This is also my email. I love helping students, talking to students, so feel free to be in touch. And yeah, I welcome your questions. Thank you so much.
Maybe? Can I be heard? Okay.
You on?
All right, we're back. All right, hi. Thank you everybody so much for coming. My name is Sarah Sowers. I am a member and treasurer right now of the Science Communicators Organization. We are a student group based in the College of Journalism that kind of encourages everyone to participate from STEM careers, policy, in any sense that is interested in communicating science for the general audience, and I'm here to ask just a couple of questions before I pass it over to anyone in the audience who might have some. So I just wanted to thank you again for speaking on our behalf and sharing all of your work with us. And I wanted to ask or start off with the fact that food seems like an increasingly political issue, as you've mentioned in your coverage. And do you think that's the case? And if so, why is it such a contentious issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think food has always been really personal and really, it's been personal. Sometimes it's seen as partisan, like left versus right, but I find that it's a little bit more complicated usually. And actually the left and the right will end up kind of meeting over certain issues, particularly around anti-corporate and, populist sort of issues like raw milk would be one, or supplements, some of the local food stuff they end up meeting. So it ends up being more complicated than I think our sort of two-party frame that we have, but it is really contentious. And I think it becomes, especially when you're talking about nutrition, it becomes very personal. People come to it with like, well, I eat this and this works for me, or why can't those people, control their willpower? And you are always bringing your personal lens into it in a way that I think is a little bit different for other issues. Like, I don't know, we maybe don't all roll into like tax policy with like super strong feelings about it because we're not thinking about our taxes 3 times a day. Hopefully you're not, yeah.
Right. And I guess you mentioned a little bit about this gridlock that we're seeing within Congress. Do you think the upcoming 2024 elections are going to have any impact on food policy in the United States?
For sure, yes. But I think it depends a whole lot on who is brought in. Like, regardless of who's president, the folks who matter, I think, more are the people leading USDA and HHS, which is above FDA, and also who the FDA commissioner is. I mentioned earlier that often the FDA commissioner doesn't come in with a strong interest or really any experience on food. Or I should have mentioned if I didn't, but food has not traditionally been a big focus of the FDA, even though it is the Food and Drug Administration. Some of the commissioners we've had over time, and actually interestingly, the one we had during the Trump administration for a good chunk of it, FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb was very interested in food and nutrition and actually moved the ball forward on some of the nutrition issues in a way that I think people wouldn't have expected. They would just go, oh, Republican administration, it's going to be deregulatory. It's going to, it's going to kind of grind everything to a halt. And it's often a little bit more complicated than that. But certainly whoever comes in has the ability to completely change what's going on. So I think it will have a big impact. It's just a little bit hard to predict, particularly because, especially in the case of Donald Trump, there isn't really a known food policy that we can look at and sort of say, oh, well, that's what he would do. We know about the trade war. There's certain things we know, but way less so on the food policy front.
Mm-hmm. And I guess when it comes to this gap between what maybe the public knows about where their food comes from and how their food is regulated, and then these policymakers who are working on things like WIC or the SNAP program to get food for those that might not be able to afford it, and then reporters like ourselves. What's one way that gap can kind of be bridged among all these different interests that are working towards food but don't really know where the future of it might be?
Yeah, I think one of the big issues I've seen in newsrooms in particular is that the reporters and editors often don't have direct experience with these programs. So like maybe their kid got school meals at school, but they maybe don't have anyone in their family who needed SNAP or who was on WIC. And I find that generally speaking, if you have a little bit more personal familiarity or some family members or some community awareness, that bridge is easier because you just kind of have it. You're not coming at it from like, oh, this is like a foreign experience, right? This is like just something that's very common, and it is very common. There's more than 40 million individuals on SNAP, and so I mean that's a pretty substantial chunk of the country. So school meals are 30 million plus kids a day. So I mean these are national programs with broad reach, but I do think it can be challenging because we have a very income inequality has sort of pulled the experiences apart, and so a lot of people don't have that common experience.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my last question before turning it over to our audience, other than maybe reading newsletters or free resources for people that don't know about food, the latest food news, do you see a future where other outlets, whether that be mainstream media or accounts like what we see on social media, will bring more light to these kinds of issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a mix of paid and free. I think like you have to get to a place where enough content is being paid for. Like even at Politico, where I was, more than half of the revenue at Politico comes from the paywalled side, or the policy coverage that's really specific. I think that this idea that all journalism and all reporting is going to be free, whether it's on, I guess we now expect it because we see it on TikTok for free, and we got it online for free for a while, that really can't continue. And nothing else is free, right? We don't expect free clothes or free cars or the other things that are essential. Information would be one of those things, eventually do have to be paid for in some way. And I think more folks are coming to the realization of that. That doesn't mean everything should be paywalled. Like we're gonna have to figure out how to keep news accessible, and that's a huge challenge, but I'm hopeful that more outlets will find that balance so that we're not in a race to the bottom and in a race where things are just slowly imploding. That's just not a good future, yeah.
All right, well, thank you. And to those that are joining us online, you can feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll have someone read them out. But to anyone in the audience, we'll take questions now.
Hi, I just wanted to start by thanking you for such an incredible presentation. I personally didn't know too much about journalism or food, and your presentation, I think, perfectly encompassed everything. So my question is about, we're seeing a lot of independent reporters on platforms such as TikTok reporting very important news. So going into the future, since they do have such a big reach, do you see this reporting being regulated, or how do you see bigger media outlets responding to this and maybe partnering? Because since they do have a big reach, how do you see that being used for good?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I'm not sure that we have a good answer yet. One of the earlier examples I gave with one of the independent newsletters called Platformer was founded by a journalist named Casey Newton, and Casey also has a podcast with the New York Times, like an institutional podcast. So there is some kind of early examples of finding those partners with outside platforms that might be a little more specialized, like on TikTok or Substack or wherever. I think more of that could happen. When it comes to some of the news content creators on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, I think there is a hesitancy in journalism to partner with folks who are not professional journalists, right? And who may not have, I am an accidental journalist and I actually didn't get any training, so this is like hilarious that I'm saying this, but they might have questions about like, were you trained properly? Like, do you know kind of the ethics of how we do this? Because there's a lot to criticize in news. I am not one of those people who has a lot of romanticism around the news business. There's a lot of flaws, a lot to criticize, but there is a lot of work put into making sure information is accurate. and when it's not, fixing it. And you don't have that on TikTok, right? So it would be interesting to see more experimentation there. I think you're right that just the incredible reach would make sense. The thing I worry about with the future of like news content creators on TikTok is I don't know how they're going to pay their bills long term, right? Like how is that going to be sustainable for them? Because you're totally at the mercy of the algorithm. And TikTok could decide that I think they have been criticized recently by a lot of creators for focusing more on the commercial side. So like selling athletic greens or jeans or whatever, that's a safer place to be than distributing news content that is being created or regurgitated or explained in some way by TikTok creators. So it's not without some risk, but the reach is just incredible. I mean, I was just today looking at some different coverage of, you may have seen that World Central Kitchen, an aid organization run by Jose Andres, lost 7 aid workers in an IDF strike in Gaza. And the amount of information I could get on like Instagram and X was way more than I could get on news, in the news, but I can't verify it. I'm not going to retweet. And so we are in this tense moment, I think, where and I should mention some of these tweets or threads had millions and millions of views, and they may be accurate. I've not done the legwork to verify them or not, but that is so much more. There's so many more eyeballs on that than there is the New York Times story about it. They would be lucky to have, hundreds of thousands of views on that story. So it is a really wild time we're living in. Great question.
Thank you for a very interesting subject. So going back to the monetizing thing again, do you ever see a scenario where somebody, I thought this would have happened by now, I wish I could have done it, comes up with some kind of, it seemed for a while there that news organizations were looking at like micropayments where you just paid for one story. And people seem maybe not as hip on, subscribing to the whole New York Times to get that one story that they wanted. Do you see that anywhere on the horizon? Yeah.
Micropayments are one of those things that like we all wish worked, but they just haven't. I am not as familiar with the like mechanics of why it doesn't work, but a lot of platforms that have tried it just do not have luck. It is much better to have someone paying you for the year or even the month or having some connective tissue with them, and maybe like if they subscribe, then actually I'm going to read this more, right? Like I'm here, so I'm going to read other content. But if you just buy that one article, and I don't know if it's that they haven't priced it right, but it just has not worked. And it's one of those things that it does get kicked around as like, wouldn't it be great if that worked? I also feel that way a lot with local news. Like I have subscribed to, a local paper just because they were at one time covering something that I thought was really good and I really needed to read and was, and then 6 months later when I'm still getting charged for it, I'm like, I really can't justify still paying for this. And that's too bad because I wanted to support them. And it's just not one of those things that has worked. But I think I think the individual news consumer would find that to be a better experience than having to buy a year of The Atlantic or whatever. Which The Atlantic, by the way, just tipped into profitability because I think they raised their prices and they have a really strong paywall. And it's also good content. Yeah. Good question, though. I wish.
Hi, Helena. Thanks for a great talk. I am interested in the kind of the niche publications, the newsletters. I guess I have 2 questions. One is the money behind them some sort of investor, or I don't know about yours in particular, but the ones you showed, they all are expensive to operate on some level. And the other part of that is when you specialize and dwell in a very specialized area, I imagine you are up against companies and interests that have teams of people that are out to confuse or debunk or take you down. And was wondering how you and others who are in that space manage that.
Yeah, really, really good questions. The first is, to my knowledge, none of those outlets have like investors or grants or anything like that. I think perhaps Casey Newton, who started Platformer, was part of an original class of independent journalists who got money from Substack. They were trying to lure more reporters to do that work, and they were like, hey, we'll give you, I don't know if there was health insurance involved, but they were trying to kind of sweeten or make it less risky. They were trying to de-risk that decision. So that there's been small amounts of startup money for that. I did not. I bootstrapped Food Fix, built a website. I knew that I was going to charge a premium. So for my paid audience, it's a few $100s a year, because I came from Politico, where I was writing for Politico Pro and for Politico.com. So I already had an audience that was used to paying for content, and Politico is much, much, much more expensive than what I charge. And so it was an easier sell. But I think the reason that all of these outlets are able to charge is because it's just a very specific value that you're getting, and that it's almost always something you can't get anywhere else. And so that just makes I think the value proposition clearer, and also it's a little bit different. They're able to also charge more. But there is, I think some folks are finding subscription fatigue. Like I pay for so much media, and I definitely have to every once in a while go through and go like, what am I actually reading? What am I actually getting value of? And that's not a bad thing. On the power dynamics thing, I do think that's a real issue. There was a time when Substack, I think maybe they still are, providing legal support. So if you have a newsletter on Substack, you can get some access to lawyers, but it's not going to be like when I was at Politico, we had like a team of very, I'm assuming, well-paid lawyers. And I have taken some freelance to Politico, even with my newsletter, in part just knowing that that process is a little bit more, you're a little bit more protected, and there's sort of a more team element there. You can get libel insurance and other things that they're cropping up sort of as the industry shifts, and I think the folks who are going to do hard-hitting reporting are going to need to find protections like that, probably. Yeah, it's a good question.
Well, I guess I have another question. When it comes to your reporting, what do you find are your biggest challenges in accessing your sources and finding a basis for your stories or your pitches, even when you're freelancing?
Yeah. One of the questions I got a lot when I first started was like, are you sure people are going to still take your calls, right? They're going to be like, what is Food Fix, right? Like, at least with Politico, there's some familiarity there. You know what that is. I have found that not to be an issue. So access to sources, access to government events, access to like press lists and stuff has been a non-issue. And I think part of that is that we are in this changing time, right? So there are more independent reporters around. There might be freelancers who are on government press lists, or who are, it's just a time where I think people are recognizing that gatekeeping around that, just because I'm not part of an institutional news organization, probably is short-sighted. I also think it helps that I've been on the same topic for 15 years. So most of the folks that I'm calling, either I know or know of me, or understand that like I'm gonna write it anyway. So it's probably better if they at least chat off the record or have some level of engagement. So I think there's a familiarity there that helps, and it helps to be focused on one topic. I do think if you were starting something from scratch and it was generalist and not known, you may face some barriers in like getting folks to talk to you because you're like, why am I talking to this random newsletter that I've never heard of? In terms of challenges, I think one of the things that I have had to figure out is like, I like focusing on reporting and writing, but now as a entrepreneur, I have to think about like, oh, like marketing, right? Like I have to figure out how to wear these other hats that I'm not used to wearing, I don't particularly like wearing. And so thankfully Food Fix has had a really good, it's grown word of mouth, it's had really good organic growth and is like sustainable and in a really good spot. But I'm very aware that there are other parts of growing this that I have to learn more. I have to learn how to do them, and then I have to probably force myself to do them more. So it's just it's a different dynamic. When you're in a newsroom, there's a reason there is a wall between the news side and the business side. And luckily with subscriptions, I'm able to keep a pretty good wall because like I don't have ads, I'm not running, I don't have I don't have to sell anyone. You're either going to buy a subscription or you're not. And like, that's just a decision that folks make. I'm not involved in sales or involved in any of that, which is nice. But I know that as more independent outlets do things like events, do things like ads, act more like a media, publisher, they need to figure out ways to have the appropriate, guardrails around that and firewalls where they can.
Thanks for a great talk. My question is, do you see the practice of journalism changing in response to the market demand, particularly from social media? So you showed that TikToker who had millions and millions of hits, but you pointed out he wasn't a journalist. He was using content that was produced by traditional journalists. Do you see, TikTok stars who are also journalists or people like you changing your presentation, changing your format, changing your delivery to adapt to the social media landscape and the AI landscape in the same way like that John Oliver sort of is a columnist in addition to being a comedian? Do you see the whole thing shifting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. By the way, John Oliver's team, their process is extensive. When they did that, I mentioned that they had used some of my reporting in a segment they did last October. I first heard from the producers of that program in February. Their process was it was as if they were doing a very intense magazine style, but fact-checked. I was stunned by their process. So I think your question is good. I mean, there is nothing about journalists being in a newsroom that makes that is special in and of itself, right? It's whether or not you're following the principles of doing everything you can to fact check and verify information. You can absolutely have citizen journalists on these platforms, and we have lots of them. I mean, I follow some of them. There's also some journalists that have left mainstream news and that are now primarily on Instagram. That is all, I think, good, but the question still becomes how are they sustainable? Are they also having a newsletter list where people are going to pay for half the content, which is what some of them are doing? There's something called Mo News, which I think that's what they're doing. There's also News Not Noise, which is by Jessica Yellen primarily on Instagram. There's several examples of this, and I actually think it can be great. But again, what I come back to is what's the business model? And also, you've built your entire audience on Instagram, which is part of Meta, which doesn't want to do news fundamentally. And so I worry about that because it's the same challenge that's plaguing digital media outlets, that's going to plague the individual. That said, they might be really, really good at explaining the news. They might be better at explaining the news than the Washington Post to millions of people. And that's fine, that's good. But you have to figure out how to make that work long term.
Alrighty, thank you so much to everyone who came out to join us today, and thank you again, Helena, for answering all these questions and sharing your work with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.